Hello and good evening and good morning wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining in for this Lamakaan online event. We are quite happy and privileged to have you all here. And this concept of having a discussion on the India's most vulnerable class was going on for quite some time. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Professor Amarullah Khan for coming forward and placing this event very very quickly. And if you remember the migrant crisis, those horrible, horrendous, and horrific images, they are still haunting all of us. More than the pandemic, times, these images of migrant laborers walking all the way to their native villages are really, really disturbing. We haven't even come out from that. And the economy is not doing well. And the most distressed class is now, I think, they are going to marginalized, and they are already marginalized. So ILO has also said so many things about these crises. So this is a very, very important discussion, I personally feel, and Lamakan take this opportunity to hold this event. I would going to take a minute or two to just introduce Dr. Amirullah. Uh, Although he doesn't need introduction, he's a good friend of Lamakan. And in turn, he's going to introduce Dr. Amitabh Kundu. Dr. Amirullah Khan is a development economist, and he is currently at the Murray Chenna Reddy HRD Institute, and he's also visiting faculty at a major, institution of repute in Hyderabad as well, like this in Hyderabad, Nalsar University, Indian School of Business, and he has been writing extensively in Livement. He writes a column there, and he was also associated with the Melinda and Gates Foundation for some time. So he wears a lot of hats. So today he is wearing this development economist hat, which is his natural, potential to understand the Indian microeconomy. So I'm going to open the stage to Dr. Amirullah Khan to take it over, and please also introduce Professor Amitabh Kundu.
Thank you so much, Naeem. And thanks to all of you for having joined us in this discussion today. My inspiration to organize this session really came from a very personal reason to hear Professor Kundu explain this crisis to us. This has not been an easy concern to handle, and there are very few people, as all of you will agree, who can explain this to us better than Professor Kundu can. He has spent a lifetime working on these issues. Professor Amitabh Kundu is currently a distinguished fellow at RIS. He was regional advisor on poverty at the UNESCWA in Beirut, consultant to government of Sri Lanka. He was chairman of the post Sachar evaluation committee, where I had the honor of being his member. And he spent years as the dean of social sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and in a lot of ways was instrumental in making the school one of the foremost in the world. His experience with statistics is legendary. He's been a member of the National Statistics Commission, understands Indian data better than anybody else that I know of. He is now chairing a committee for the Swachh Bharat mission in the Ministry of Drinking Water, and is chairperson of Samarthan, where he is working with the same poor and vulnerable people that we are going to talk about today. This evening, what we have in store for you is that we will have Professor Kundu with his talk. He's prepared a very focused deck that he will present to you now. We will start with his presentation. I will then come in for a little bit, and then we will throw it open for discussions. Meanwhile, I would encourage all of you to put down your questions, your comments, your concerns on the chat window, so that we can seamlessly get into the discussion after his conversation. So please feel free to keep on jotting down your issues on the chat window. And now, may I invite Professor Amitabh Kundu to put up his screen.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Namaskar. It's a privilege for me to share the platform with Professor Amirullah Khan, a person I know with very clear vision about the goals of life, which he pursues with dedication, with total commitment, and with massive energy. I don't want to talk a little more on that, otherwise it will look like a mutual appreciation club. But it's also very important even for me because we are talking about one of the most critical issues in India's economic development right now, perhaps next to the problem of the pandemic. And there seems to be some kind of a solution emerging, if not within a month, but in a few months. But the problem of vulnerable workforce requires structural solutions and structural intervention. That's why I think it's an important topic that Lamakaan has chosen to deliberate on. And the third most important thing about it is Lamakaan itself. The topic for discussion today appears very simple analytically. Also, it's useful as a policy instrument. I said it's simple because there is a standard definition available, and vulnerable workforce is generally associated with either informal workers or unorganized workers. And for both the terms, we have a standard definition and we have regular database available from the official sources, from National Sample Survey, from economic census, and basically both unorganized workers and both are defined as a residual category. The definition of unorganized worker is very simple. You define organized sector, and what is not organized is unorganized. The National Commission for Enterprises on Unorganized Sector, which was headed by Arjun Singh Gupta, gives a very clear-cut definition. I just want to go into the definitional matter, which is somewhat boring, but I could see among the participants, my all friends and students, and those who are really interested. I think let me spend 5 to 7 minutes on this definition. Unincorporated enterprises. This is a very complex term, but basically it means that it should not be registered. If it is a manufacturing, it should not be registered under the Factories Act. If it is an business enterprise, it should not be registered under the Companies Act of 1957. If it is power generation, there is a registration for that. It should not be registered. Basically, all government, semi-government, quasi-government are excluded for informal sector. Basically, informal sector is defined not in terms of poverty. I would like to emphasize. You can't say something where the earnings are less is informal. It could be, may not be true. It can be many informal activities, lawyers, doctors, those who are running coaching classes, they are all, many of them are informal. The definition of the informal sector or unorganized sector is based on the organization of production, not on the basis of technology, earning, productivity, or vulnerability. So let us first clear our mind that to say that informal sector entirely is vulnerable, unorganized workforce is totally vulnerable is not correct. And that's why both National Commission on Unorganized Sector and also the informal sector has a global definition, because the 15th and the 17th International Conference of Labor Statisticians, in fact, these conferences define the terms which can be then uniformly applied across the countries so that we can get data on informal sector or other labor-related issues in a comparable manner. So the UN system has said that unincorporated enterprises, even, as I mentioned, that labor statisticians have decided that those who are not registered under their sectoral agencies, those which are run purely as a household enterprise, but household does not necessarily mean only the people from the household. It can employ people, but it should not be registered as a production unit. It should be organized as a part of the household activity, and that is how an unincorporated enterprise is defined globally and happily in India. Economic census and PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey data, you know that survey report was not allowed to come out. There was some controversy. Happily, we have two reports coming. So basically, what I'm saying that on unorganized sector, which can be a powerful instrument for policy intervention, we have the data on the unorganized sector because it is defined as a residual category. You have the organized sector. Take that out, contribution of organized sector from the total value added, you get the value added of unorganized sector. Similarly, informal sector is also defined, and we have PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey, which uses this definition of informal sector. Economic census in India also uses the definition which the International Conference of Labor Statisticians have said. So basically, we have no problem if we take unorganized sector and informal sector, and general assumption is that vulnerable workforce means unorganized workers and informal workers. Now, this is the definition of the unorganized or informal sector. There is something like a definition, and then you should distinguish that from the characteristics. Let me give you an example. For example, a potato can be defined in terms of, but then there are many other fallout, certain, you know, factors which are associated with that are not part of the definition. Can we go to the next one? I've given the definition here, and I'm emphasizing the definition of informal sector and unorganized sector is not based on the productivity, technology, poverty, nothing. It is defined on the organization of production. It should not be registered. It should be basically on the household basis. But now I'm giving the characteristics, which is not really part of the definition. But once you apply that definition, the subset that you get of the unorganized sector or informal sector has the following features. But again, let me emphasize that these are not essentially part of the definition. It is possible that some informal activities and unorganized activities can have exactly opposite characteristics. Now, the characteristics are informal sector and unorganized sector operate at a low scale. The labor relations are based on kinship, personal and social relations, not contractual agreement, all casual employment. Household enterprises have assets and expenditure. They can have assets, but those assets are almost part of the household. There is no separate production unit which owns the assets. Assets and expenditure are part of the household expenditure. Similarly, low technology, low productivity, low earning is the general characteristic, but that is not a part of the definition. It is possible many of the informal activities, unorganized activities can have a high earning capacity. Mostly the informal activities do not have to follow the rules because they're not registered. They don't make many tax payments, but it is quite possible that some activities some informal activities and unorganized activities have that. Similarly, as informal enterprise, you don't enter into transaction with other units, don't have any liabilities. These are the characteristics. Why I am making a distinction between the definitional part and the characteristic part is that the equivalence that we give, that vulnerable sector means informal sector, vulnerable workforce means all those people who are in the unorganized sector are vulnerable. That is not correct. It's very important that within informal sector, we try to find out who are more vulnerable. Similarly, within the formal sector, there can be workers who are vulnerable. Within the organized sector also, there are many hired laborers who are vulnerable. So to take informal sector and unorganized sector as equivalent of vulnerable workforce is not correct. And there comes my problem. I was talking to a ex-member of National Commission for Unorganized Workers. I asked him What is the difference between informal sector and unorganized sector? After talking to me for 10 minutes, he said, I'll have to check. There is some nuanced definition. Then again, I asked that, do we have any clear-cut, estimation? Well, there are various estimations. And in fact, as I said, in case of Lamakaan, the boundaries are not defined for the informal sector. You take out the formal sector and the rest comes up, and that's why we have varying estimates. So my initial statement that informal sector and unorganized sector are powerful tools of intervention because we have proper definition, we have proper data set, that stands questioned because the data that we have are not really of the vulnerable workforce. We do not have the data on vulnerable workers within the informal sector, vulnerable workers within the unorganized sector. And that is this problem that we all got stuck up when we talked about the interstate migrants. Interstate migrants on an average have a much higher level of earning than the non-migrants. To say all interstate migrants are vulnerable workers is absolutely not correct. So when the lockdown was imposed, we were at a loss to find out who are the vulnerable workers, how many of them are coming from which district, where they want to go. And first, I had a meeting with the people in the Niti Aayog. I said, first priority before you start promoting the labor intensive industries and put the economy in the front gear, we have to first take the people to their places of origin because they are desperate to go back because of social psychological reasons, because also the cities have not treated them well. We did not have the data because, as I said, we have the data for informal sector, unorganized sector, but that is not coterminous with the vulnerable workforce. Can we go down? Yes, next one, please. Now, I'm just giving a map. This tells the interstate male migrants. We have the data for total migrants as a percentage of the total population. We have the data for the absolute number. But can you believe in 2020, we have this data from district to district matrix. We have about 740, but perhaps comparable figures is possible for 650 districts. We don't have the data even for 2011 census because there are some changes in the district boundaries. This table has been prepared only for 2001. That is when we had a discussion in the Niti Aayog. I said, look at this, apathy. I always felt that the migration statistics is like Cinderella. It gets the least attention from the policy makers. The next graph is 2011. Yes, it also for 2000. This is for 2001. Sorry, and we do not have the data for 2011 census district to district. Now, on the request of the officials of the Niti Aayog, I immediately tried to prepare the total number of, can we go back to the last one? I tried to prepare some kind of an estimate of total number of vulnerable interstate migrants, because total interstate migrants as given in the 2011 census, total figures we have, I'm saying district to district origin destination matrix, we do not have even for 2011 census, which really shows that we are not really very serious about treating the interstate migrants in a very respectable manner. We don't have even the basic statistics on that. So what I did was to find out the total number of vulnerable migrants who would like to go back to their places of origin. Please go down. Now we have from PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey data for 2017-18. We know that how many of the total workers are regular salaried workers and how many of them are casual workers. That figure we have for 2017-18. I made some adjustment from, this is for the total, I made some adjustment for the migrants using the 2007-8 NSS data. We go to the next one. This is state level figures of regular salaried workers. Next table, please. It shows that out of the total regular salaried workers, 48% of the workers do not have any social security. Imagine 48% of those who are getting regular salaries, even domestic help get regular salary. Anyone who gets monthly salary is a regular salaried worker. To say that regular salaried workers are not vulnerable is not correct. 48% of them are vulnerable. Casual wages, 82% of them do not have any kind of social security. So I took these figures to the migrant table and tried to estimate how many of the total migrants, interstate migrants, are in regular workers category, are in casual wage category, and how many of them are in self-employed category. Please go to the next table. As far as the self-employed are concerned, no data is available on their access to social security. So I have to calculate the total number of self-employed person who are vulnerable. So what I did was to take the regular worker's salary, those who are not having any social security among the regular workers. And that comes to something like 9,000 rupees. You see at the bottom, this is the average salary of a regular worker who do not have the social security. But on an average, regular workers get 17,000 plus, but those who do not get social security get 9,000. So among the self-employed, I try to identify state-wise how many of them do not have even 9,000 earning, and those are the people who are vulnerable. So thereby I calculated the total number of vulnerable workers among regular workers, among self-employed and casual workers. Please go to the next one. So using that, I tried to calculate the total number of vulnerable interstate migrants who would be rendered jobless immediately after the lockdown or within 3 or 4 months. This is the calculation which shows that 49% of the self-employed do not have even the earning, the minimum earning, which is necessary for social security. Please go to the next one. I want to go quickly over the next few slides. I calculated the total number of vulnerable migrants, interstate migrants, using the census and NSS data and provided to the planners. And I said, please arrange for movement of 8 million people, 7 to 8 million people in the months of March immediately, so to avoid this. And this paper, I brought it out in the media and also talked to the people. And well, I do not know, within 2-3 weeks, the train Shramik expresses did start. And I'll just tell you roughly how I calculated the number of vulnerable interstate migrants. As I said, the data do not exist. You have to calculate based on certain assumptions. 2020, I calculated the interstate migrants because 2011, we had 55 million. We applied the growth rate of 2001 and 11, and I found out that the total interstate migrants, I'm talking about interstate migrants, total migrants will be something like 457 million, which includes people who have moved from one village to another within the district. But 75 million is the estimated interstate migrant population. But out of that, 15% are outside the urban areas, 85% are in or around the urban areas. So 64 million interstate migrants are in and around the major urban centers. That's my first stage of calculation. Please go to the next one. Now, out of this 64 million migrant population, I put them into 3 categories: regular, casual, and self-employed. And 64 million migrants, that all of them are not workers. There's a family there. So I found out the total number of workers will be 42 million out of 64 million. This 42 million is distributed among regular, casual, and self-employed in this manner. I calculated the vulnerability, those who don't have social security. I applied those coefficients, and I found out that the total interstate migrant workers who are vulnerable, who will be rendered jobless, is 25 million, which is given at the bottom. You see, on the basis of various assumptions and using this NSS and population census data, we found out that 25 million interstate migrants would be vulnerable. Next one, please. Now, 25 million workers destabilized with a family size of 1.5. So multiply 25 by 1.5, you get 37.5 million people. And out of them, 6.9 million are short duration, sorry, 6.9 million short duration migrants are estimated all the time. But for 2020, this will be something like 9.5 million. Out of this 9.5 million people, 60% of them would be in urban areas on March 23 when lockdown was imposed. So I take 60% of 9.5 million, which is the estimated short duration migrants. By the way, short duration migrants are those who have traveled for less than 6 months. Officially, they're not considered as migrants. For being a migrant, you have to live at a place for more than 6 months. So taking that, the total estimated vulnerable interstate migrants is 43 million. And basically, I'm saying that from the official statistics which is available, it is not possible to find out the vulnerable population, although we feel that informal sector and unorganized sector is a good proxy. They're certainly not good proxy, and we need to strengthen our database. Okay, now look at the relaxations in the labor laws. I can well understand that the major issue today is this vulnerable workforce, and people have a choice of either taking the risk of COVID-19 or the risk of hunger and starvation, and risk the entire family. And I understand the urgency of many of the state governments, and when the measures relaxations were announced by different states, in a way I said yes, this is what is required because the economy needs to be given a boost. You are all familiar perhaps that Uttar Pradesh has gone in for massive labor laws relaxation, barring the some of the provisions of the Factories Act of 1948, Construction Workers Act of 1946, Child Labor Act could not be touched, Maternity Benefit Act could not be touched, Equal Remuneration Act could not be touched, Bonded Labor Act could not be touched, but all the other labor laws are suspended for 3 years in Uttar Pradesh. And that has been in a way welcomed by, I would say, the corporate sector, industries. There are concerns among the workers, but some of the politicians and the academics feel that some labor reform was required, but whether UP should have done so much in terms of changing the labor laws is something which is being questioned. In Madhya Pradesh, the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947 has been amended, allowing new establishments exemptions from most of the provisions under the Industrial Disputes Act. So that's a very, very constraining factor. And this relaxation will be for 1,000 days, about 3 months. There will be exemption from the Factories Act of 1948. MP Madhya Pradesh Factories Rule 1962 also will be relaxed. That they're always saying that Chapter 5B of Industrial Dispute Act, which is very critical, that should not be touched. There is a demand from the trade unions, although the World Bank and the IMF want the modification in the Chapter 5B of Industrial Disputes Act. But let me tell you, we estimated the total number of workers covered under this Chapter 5B, which means at least 100 people should be on regular basis working. Those cover only 5.5% of the total workers, and for hired workers is 12%. So even if we don't touch them, the large section of the workers are being seriously affected. I'm saying that Chapter 5B, all the state governments are saying we are not touching that, which is for the organized sector, but that really protects only 5.5% of the total workforce. Go to the next one, please. We have other states which are following the suit. Gujarat has exempted all factories registered under the Factories of 1948 from the provisions relating to weekly hours, daily hours, intervals for rest, etc. for all the new projects for next 3 months. Rajasthan has done the same thing. The number of hours have been raised, but the payment for the additional 4 hours will be based not on the basis of extra payment, but on the regular salaries. The extension amount will be paid. Similarly, Himachal Pradesh has gone for significant exemptions from the different laws. particularly in the context of the number of hours and working conditions. I have not really studied in that great depth about the implications of this, and we don't have the statistics so quickly coming up. But I thought that some of these exemptions would help the economy to pick up at least in the next 3-4 months. But I have always maintained that these laws should be subject to scrutiny by the end of the year, because all the achievements that has come up in the labor market in terms of trade union movement should not be lost, because state has assumed significant powers during the period of the pandemic, and the civil society and the people willingly have sacrificed their powers and giving it to the state because of the emergency, medical emergency. But I think that this relaxation, without examining their impact on the economy, cannot be extended for more than 3-4 months. Please go to the next one. I just want to tell you a story about the Black Death, the Bubonic plague in England, which started in 1348, and it killed 1/3 of the total European population. It also spread to the developing countries. And as a result of that, to give boost to the economy, in 1349, there was an ordinance for the laborers which restricted the wages of the laborers to the pre-plague period. He said there will be no increase in the wages of the workers. What was existing earlier will be maintained. And because laborers may run away from London to other places, big cities, it was forbidden. Movement of laborers were also restricted. They could not move anywhere. And a statute of laborers came in 1351 in England. But this was a spectacular failure. There were violations all around. Everybody saw it as a method of appeasing the industrialists through coercive engagement of the labor at starvation wages. The statute, I'm talking about the statute of 1351, became the major contributory factor for the peasants' revolt in 1381 that broke large parts of England, first great popular uprising in the English history. This resulted in emergency course corrections. Immediately, some tax labor reforms were brought in, but it was too late. It was heavy cost that whole Europe paid in terms of life and property. I just gave a brief history of a similar or more severe pandemic and how the laws were modified, and it was realized after 1381 revolt that many of the measures were very quick measures were implemented without any empirical verification. Please go to the next one. Now, I'm saying in the Indian context also, after 2014-15, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, they had some modifications. Also, Chapter B, 5B, I told you, Industrial Disputes Act of 1947-50, contract labor, there were some modifications, but all these modifications that were brought in 2014-15, the study showed, I have 3-4 references I can give later on, that provided no incentive for investment. Rather, it led to increased exploitation and worsening of the conditions of the workers. Similarly, the Gujarat model of development, often treated as an aspiration model, was characterized by relaxation or non-implementation of labor laws in special economic zones. Indeed, that was big success in attracting capital, but it led to capital-intensive growth and no proportional increase in employment took place. So basically what I'm saying, we should learn from the history, medieval history, the history of Europe, and also our recent history before we feel very confident that these relaxations in law will help in rebuilding our economy at a very fast pace. Last 2 slides, please. Concluding remarks, I would say in that there are 2 approaches to strengthening the labor negotiations in the labor market to help the laborers. One approach is that laws of the land should enable the workers' collectives, trade unions, to participate in the management decisions. That is one way wherein you can strengthen the power of labor in the economic development process. This is called the German model of co-determination, wherein the laws strengthen the trade unions for collective bargaining. Second is the labor laws should strengthen the individual workers themselves so that they can go to the labor market and bargain. We know that the first model is far more powerful because the second model, individually laborers do not have that kind of a strength. Indian labor law framework was originally conceived as a combination of both strengthening the trade unions as well as strengthening the individual workers. But gradually, we have seen the German model, which is strengthening the trade unions that have been weakened over time, is only the individual workers who do not have much power, they are in the scene. But I just wanted to refer to one judgment which is very significant. This is a seven-judge Supreme Court judgment, Krishna Kumar Singh versus the state of Bihar. The state of Bihar had brought certain ordinances, and the judgment went much beyond those ordinances and said that many of these ordinances are non-constitutional, and they are really reflecting abuse by the state governments of the legal framework. It argues that all such ordinances are subject to judicial challenge. State ordinances and amendments of law are subject to judicial scrutiny and liable to be struck down on constitutional grounds. This is a judgment given as late as 2017. Please go to the last slide, please. You know, history, we should learn from history to make a prediction, but we should also learn from history to transcend history. History repeats itself, but it can be transcended through foresight and planning. We should not be walking down the dangerous path that we have seen in Europe. And I personally believe that all the modifications that have been done for 3 months or 3 years, all of them must be revisited by December 2020 to see how these have helped in bringing in more investment and generating employment, and to what extent they can be continued for future months. And that is certainly a very big challenge. The gains in the labor market that we have achieved through years of struggle should not be just filtered away like this, and a revisiting of the labor laws would be extremely important. I'm sorry, I think I've exceeded the time, Amir Bhai, that you allotted to me, but I thought I would just give some of the basic facts also, because sometimes these escape our mind. So I brought this, and I will be very happy to have questions, comments, and criticisms. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Kundu. And thanks to the fact that your presentation covered just about everything that I wanted to talk about. So we are just jumping straight ahead. I just wanted to add to what you said by showing you what I had in mind, and that was that we are really looking at yeah we are we, I mean, most of what I wanted to say you've said. My I just have a couple of small points that I thought I will make just to add to what you described so well. The point that I was making was in terms of wages. So you've all heard Professor Kundu is talked about the vulnerability, the migrant workforce, the numbers that we are talking about. I am just making one extra point, and that extra point came from the discussion on labor law that started before COVID. So you see, Professor Kundu talked about Vasundhara Raje government starting off the process in 2014 with the Chandrababu government in Andhra, and then the new moves that were made by Shivraj Chauhan as a new chief minister this March, and Gujarat and Assam. But what has fallen by the wayside is really the discussion on minimum wages. If you all remember that in December, for the first time, the government tried to bring in conversation around the minimum wage um, in discussion. And my worry is that because of all this that has happened, this important point is going to be missed now, and I don't know if we will ever get back to discussing the revision of minimum wages. In a surprising move, the NDA government, 2019, brought in the issue of minimum wages, which was not seen as possible. So if you look at our wages, they are, to say the least, pathetic. And this chart shows you how the wages are as far as we are concerned. In fact, if you look at the minimum wages, then look at this table where we show that this enormous difference that we have, that if you are in Haryana or Kerala, the minimum wage under the NREGA is close to 300, suggestion is 450, and in Bihar it's 160. Take a guess, the lowest is not Bihar, the lowest is Tripura, where the minimum wage is 40 rupees, 40 rupees a day. And I just put a table to your left which shows that we are talking about Russia and Brazil, which is $1 an hour. And in India, we are talking about half a dollar a day in states like Tripura. So the vulnerability is very high when we are talking about minimum wages. The fact is, and that again Professor Kundu made, the fact is that the labor law is very complicated, it is archaic, it is draconian. There are too many laws in any case. There are at least 200, thousands of labor unions. I was looking at this Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act that actually says that even a mere movement in or a change in the job description is not allowed. So it is time for labor law reform, but the timing, coinciding with the time when we were all distracted by COVID, was where we really made a mistake. The point that is being made here is that the Vasundhara Raje government made these changes. It couldn't have been done at a worse time, because immediately afterwards demonetization came and the reforms just appeared to have done everything wrong, because unemployment went up dramatically and the state GDP went down. This is what you have already seen in terms of UP, Gujarat. Each state was competing with the other to give away the relaxation. 3 years, 1,000 days, 1,200 days. That is what we saw happening in this competition between MP, UP, and Gujarat. And then came Assam, which did an interesting thing, which said that we will now have fixed contracts for workers. That was a new move that Assam did, and moved towards a 12-hour shift. Now, this 12-hour shift, one wonders how this is going on. And if we are going to talk about unemployment, then it seems bizarre that if we want to have more people working, should you have 12-hour shifts or should you have 6-hour shifts? This didn't seem to make any sense. The last point I wanted to make is that in this situation, what we need to do is really insist upon a minimum wage. The economic survey of just 2 years ago made a big point about a high minimum wage, and that is something that this calamity and this debacle should have made us get quickly onto the table. Because if we cannot do a minimum payment, we cannot do a basic income at this point in time, then what will we do to get this entire population going, and how will we get the economic stimulus moving? The point that I want to end with is that this entire debate would have been great if the union government would have hastened the process of just announcing either a high minimum wage, which they had already promised 3 years ago, or a universal basic income, which would have served two purposes. It would have enabled people to have enough money to fend for themselves against starvation, and it would have given a little extra money for stimulus to work when the epidemic ends and people use that extra money to buy whatever they can. That is what I had to add. We will go back to Professor Kundu now and to the participants, where we have some questions that are already there, Professor Kundu.
As regards the uh, protection of rights, what is that? Oh, how can we stop the people going?
Yeah, in fact, let me begin with your issue that you raised. In fact, after this Agricultural Labour Commission's report, the NDA government took this task of putting the labor laws into four codes. You must be aware the four codes were first pertaining to wages, second to industrial relations, third to occupational safety, and the fourth to social security and the welfare. Now, wages was the first code which was formalized. A committee was set up, and that has been approved without really other three codes. And the Labour Minister Gangwar mentioned that in January that other three will also come up. So we are waiting. The minimum wages, Amir Bhai, has been proposed is something like 40% higher in case of many of the activities than the present one. But well, as I said, that this has not been implemented. I do not know on the face of so many relaxations that have been given by different state governments, how the report which has been approved will be implemented and how the other three areas, other three codes will be formalized. So that is a big question mark. And I think certainly all those who are concerned must really ask for formalization of the other three codes and also see that the wages code, which has been in a way approved, is taken forward, adjusted by the price indices. As far as the labor laws are concerned, I recall before about 6 years, myself and Dr. Alaknarayan Sharma, we edited a book on informal sector, and there are two papers. One was by Dr. Popola, late Dr. Popola, and other Ajit Ghosh, and there are two, three other papers which really went into the evaluation of the changes of the labor laws and how India has shifted from so-called German model, where the trade unions had a lot of power in bargaining, to really weakening of that. And I wouldn't offhand recall that because I did not do that study, but certainly I would refer to the book on the informal sector. There are two, three chapters on the labor laws and show how they have evolved over time. So, as far as Venkateshwarlu, your question about the actual number is concerned, as I said, that in the media, I have been asked questions and I often found that the exact reply, the figure goes in without mentioning what it stands for. Sometimes the figure is 40 million, which is the worker or the total migrants. Is
Yeah.
it total migrants or interstate migrants? So I often get really worried about giving an interview. But I can tell you the total migrants, as estimated by 2011 census, is 457 million. That's the total migrants, where the woman will be the predominant because within the district, females predominate the migration, the marriage migration which takes place. When you take the interstate migrants, the figure is 55 million in 2011. I applied the growth rate and some medium average growth rate, and you get a figure of 75 million. That's the total interstate migrants. And among the migrants, 66% of them are workers. It's much higher than the non-migrants because the dependency ratio among the migrants is low. So for one worker, there is half a non-worker. That means two workers will make one dependent coming up. So what I did was to estimate the total number of interstate migrants and then how many of them are workers around the big cities, and then divided them into three categories and found out how many of them will have social security and for regular, for self-employed and for casual. And we found something like 42, 43 million would be vulnerable people. This includes, as I said, family members also. All of them do not want to go back. That's another thing because at least 30% of them had worked out some kind of an informal arrangement to either with the landlords or with the company to stay back. So they stayed back. But desperately, at least 8 to 10 million people wanted to go back. And that is also determined on the basis of the registration, which many of the migrants did with the state government. You add up the figures. And in fact, in I thought that we had mentioned about 6 to 7 million initially to the Niti Aayog. That was on the underestimation. I think 8 to 10 million people went back by train, by various other informal methods. Although it is true that only not more than 50, 60,000 people perhaps gone by cycles or by walking, but that's a huge number. 60,000 people with family members walking back, cycling is a matter of national shame. And I always say it is not the COVID 19 which made them vulnerable. It only exposed how vulnerable they have all along been. You ask a migrant, say, are you mad that you think of walking for 400 kilometers with your wife? No, he's not mad. She is not mad because they are already working in an inhuman condition for 12 hours. They think another 2 hours I will work, I will reach home. So actually, the kind of suffering they had during their walk, they have at least 70, 80% of the suffering in any case. So I personally feel that the COVID really highlighted how vulnerable the informal sector is. It did not fragment our society. It showed only revealed how fragmented our society is. And this is really time that we take stock of the labor legislation, we take stock of the conditions under which the interstate migrants live, and see to it that they will certainly come back because the rural economy, no matter how rapidly they grow in the less developed states, would be able to absorb even 30% of the total return migrants. They will come back, but I hope the cities become somewhat more hospitable to these migrants when they come back in terms of their wages and in terms of the working conditions. Thank you.
What would be the reverse migration cycle back? Because one of the other questions is about, because the subtitle of this way forward, do you think the government of India has taken enough concrete initiatives to take care of the problem of informality as such? Although there are few boards like the workers welfare boards and also the unorganized social security act and so on, how do you look at these initiatives?
As I said on the first issue, that the total number of persons who have been rendered vulnerable as a result of uh, uh, this pandemic coming up during the period of March, April, May, I think these are they will be panic statistics. We cannot really get much because things are changing on the weekly basis. People's decision to go back, or the some factory owners who said, sorry, we would not be able to pay them more than 2 weeks. I talked to some people personally. They said if we knew that it will continue for only another 2 months, we would have made them stay, but we did not know how long it will continue. So I would not really give much credence to the CMI data for these 2 3 months. But nonetheless, PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey, which showed the highest unemployment rate in 45 years, the next second PLFS data did show some slight decline in the unemployment by weekly status and daily status. So I thought that was the rock bottom we had hit. Things were somewhat becoming better, but nonetheless, now we have really sunk much below the wrong rock bottom that we had thought. And I personally believe that the three other codes which have are yet to be finalized, and the minister has made an announcement in January that we will bring it out. I think they need to be addressed immediately because they said draft is with the select committee. The code was on industrial relation, occupational safety, and social security. These are much more important than just giving the wages. As I mentioned, I've looked at the wages code and they have proposed substantial increase, about 40% increase in the minimum wages for different sectors based on their skill requirements. But the other three codes need to be finalized. They have to be approved, and I think the researchers, administrators should put pressure on the central government to do that. And more important, all the relaxations that are being now being brought in to give a boost to the economy, and people are saying, okay, yes, unemployment is a major issue, we have to do something. All these laws must be reviewed, revisited by the end of the year. Otherwise, I think we might be creating long-term problems in the labor market.
Is there any group, particularly in the informal sector, who are much more vulnerable than the rest?
Well, as if you take the three categories of workers, one is regular workers, and as we noted from the PLFS latest data 2017-18, that 48% of the people who are regular workers are not having any social security. 82% of the casual workers do not have any social security. And as far as the self-employed are concerned, about 48% of the self-employed have earnings which is less than what the regular workers who do not have social security get. So, and the self-employed have much lower average wages. So it's very clear that the estimate that we have for the migrant population, 42 million, are vulnerable. We have said again and again that 42 million vulnerable does not mean that 42 million would like to go back to their villages. Many of them had made some kind of an arrangement, and we said that something like, at that time we are talking about 6 to 8 million, but I think that was on the slightly lower side, about because some people have gone back by different tools. And if the government would have done some amount of thinking preparation before the lockdown being imposed, because what we find that when the lockdown, when the corona incidence was low, the fear of corona was very high. And now that the corona incidence has gone up, I find even among the common people in Delhi, the fear seems to have gone down. And the talk about economy is on the forefront. And I personally feel that there should have been a better planning with regard to the informal sector, because even the coverage of the informal sector in terms of some 1,000 rupees of compensation being paid for the auto rickshaw workers, construction workers, the registration was only 50 to 60%. And there are many surveys conducted showed that many of these vulnerable sections of the population did not get their legitimate share. Only one thing which worked largely, about 70-80% benefited, is the free food grain. And that, I think, is a good measure. And I know that many families are getting more food that they are consuming. They're selling them back. I have distinct information at lower prices, but nonetheless, the selling of that is giving them 70% of the value of the grains back, because 30% is the commission which the fellows who are buying are getting, but it is also giving them some amount of earning besides the food grain. So I'm not that worried, because if you store the food grains in the godowns of FCI, there is a leakage in any case with the rats and other things. So there is some 30% leakage if you give to the poor and they sell it. I would not be terribly disturbed about that. But nonetheless, there should have been a better preparation before the lockdown. Thank you.
Yeah, but things haven't changed in the last 50 years. The data shows the 90% and above informal sector was existing even before 50 years. So there are no concrete measures or initiatives as such being taken.
You see, the point is the figures for the informal sector varies depending on the definition. As I said, unincorporated. Now, what happens to the NGO sector? If they are registered with the concerned NGO authority, they are also considered to be formal. Entire agriculture can be considered as informal. The PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey for 2017-18, shows that out of the total non-agricultural employment, about 68% are informal. So the figures vary, but what is more worrying is that the entire unorganized sector is not informal. Entire interstate migrants are not vulnerable. Their vulnerability has to be culled out of the data, and unfortunately, the present data system do not give very clear-cut information about the vulnerability parameters. It gives information about informal workers, unorganized workers, but one would have to work a lot with the data at the unit level to find out the vulnerable population among informal workers and among unorganized workers. Thank you.
So is there anybody who has any questions to ask or queries, reflections?
Anyway, since it is opened up, I want to ask sir, see, many of these workers who left these cities with a lot of bitterness, especially from Maharashtra, Gujarat, Surat, what percentage of them will never come back? At least just as a guess. And what will happen to those economic activities? Real estate has come to a standstill in big cities.
To answer this question with definitive empirical evidence would be difficult. But I can tell you there's a large number of civil society organizations working in different states of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and one of the organizations which is working in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, they have already conducted this kind of a survey to find out that already 45% of the returned migrants want to go back. They don't want to do the manual labor, many of them. And there is tough competition. Even the locals think that they are taking a share. The number of the Manrega days, uh, there was a demand to increase that from 100 to 150. There has been some increase of 20 rupees per day in the minimum wages, but certainly the rural economy is not in a position to absorb. Most of the states are finding it difficult to really absorb the existing labor force. And I know that industrialists in Delhi, in Gujarat, in Kerala also, there are people who are wanting them to come back, and they are already trying to contract people there. And I think despite relatively high growth rate of the state domestic product in many of the less developed states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, from 2004-5, you find their growth rate has been slightly higher than the national average. So you can see that earlier it was the other way around. Less developed states grew at a lower pace, but from 2004-5 onwards, the growth rate of many of the less developed states have picked up. Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, their growth rates have been higher than the national average, and yet the rate of out migration has not gone down. So even if the chief ministers try, emotionally they are saying now they should take our permission. I think that is not constitutional. The laborers have to decide themselves, and the Constitution, Article 19, allows the people to take this decision. Any restriction by those who are receiving the migrants or sending the migrants, if they impose any conditionalities on the individual laborers that they have to take permission, that can be challenged in the court. Southern states, the population growth rate is near stabilization. Total fertility rate is 2.1. So there will be no actual increase in the labor force. And Bihar, northern and western states are growing. Total fertility rate is somewhere near 3. So obviously north-south imbalance in the growth of labor force will be there. So there has to be migration. You can't say, let there be no interstate migration. There has to be migration, interstate migration for the next 3 decades, but let the migration stream be more human, more inclusive, and the cities treat them much better than they did before. That is what we should be striving for, and I think the central government formalizing the other 3 codes and implementing the wage code would be very important in this matter.
Thank you.
Ashar bhai, Amir bhai, anything else?
Ji, nahi, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. Naeem, shall we wrap it up now?
Okay. Sure. I'm just going to take 1 minute to propose formal vote of thanks. But before that, there is this quick announcement that I wanted to make. Next week, 3 days, 9th, 10th, and 11th, Lamakaan is organizing 3-day night school, which is one of its almost like a flagship program. So please do join us. The details are there on our website as well as on our Facebook page. This night school is on the planetary web of life. The entire food cycle, how the food is being consumed, consumerism. There are various topics basically, and this is conducted by Dr. Radha Gopalan, and she will be there for 3 days. So you're most invited. And I would take this opportunity on behalf of Lamakaan and also on my personal behalf to thank Professor Kundu for joining us and also giving a wonderful presentation and taking all these questions very, very patiently. And I would also like to thank Amir Sahab, a dear friend of Lamakaan, for joining us. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.